The dusty stagecoach rattled over the last mile of dirt road, its wheels creaking with each turn. The small town of Copper Creek shimmered in the heat of the afternoon sun. It wasn't much more than a handful of wooden buildings, a saloon with swinging doors, a blacksmith's forge, and a general store. But for Eleanor Hayes, the sight of this settlement meant the beginning of a new life, or so she hoped. Eleanor clutched the crumpled letter in her gloved hand, the letter that had promised her security, and perhaps even happiness. She had agreed, against all instincts, to travel hundreds of miles from the only home she had ever known, answering an advertisement for a mail-order bride. Her parents were gone, her prospects in the city were none, and the letter had spoken kindly of a rancher named Thomas Cole, who longed for a wife to share his land and life. But as the stagecoach slowed and stopped, dust billowing around it, Eleanor's stomach tightened with dread. She adjusted her bonnet nervously, stepped down onto the dirt street, and searched the faces around her. Men leaned against posts, spitting tobacco. Women peeked from behind curtained windows. But there was no warm smile, no hand raised in welcome. Instead, silence greeted her, followed by whispers. "Mail-order bride," one man muttered with a chuckle. "Poor fool," another sneered. Heat flushed Eleanor's cheeks. She clutched her bag tighter and looked around desperately. Where was Thomas Cole? Where was her future husband? Then, a man she hadn't noticed before stepped forward. His clothes were fine, his boots polished, and his mustache curled at the ends. A golden watch chain gleamed across his vest. He smiled, but there was something in his eyes that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "Well now," he drawled, tipping his hat, "you must be Miss Hayes." "Yes, I'm looking for Thomas Cole," Eleanor stammered. The man's smile widened, though it held no kindness. "Ah, I'm afraid you've come too late. Thomas passed away some weeks back. Ranch accident. Tragic business." Eleanor's heart stopped. Passed away? The man in the letter, the man she had traveled to marry, was dead? She swayed on her feet, clutching her bag tighter. The stranger leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "But don't you worry yourself. You're far too pretty to be left all alone in a rough town like this. I'll see to it you're taken care of." His hand brushed against her sleeve. Fear stabbed through Eleanor. She stepped back, shaking her head. "No, I'll manage." But the man's grip tightened on her arm. Now, don't be foolish. Women don't survive long here without protection." Panic surged. Eleanor's gaze darted around. No one intervened. The townsfolk simply watched. Desperate, she thrust her hand into her bag and drew out the only weapon she had, her silver hatpin. With trembling determination, she jabbed it into the man's hand. He yelped, jerking back, cursing furiously. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Eleanor, breathless and shaking, stumbled backward. And then a shadow fell across the street. A tall man with broad shoulders stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. His face bore a long scar that cut from temple to jaw, giving him a fierce, untouchable look. But it wasn't the man who caught Eleanor's breath. It was the small child hiding behind his leg, peeking out with wide eyes. The man's voice was deep, steady, and calm. "Is there a problem here?" The banker scowled, still clutching his hand. "Just teaching this girl her place. She doesn't know the way things work in Copper Creek." The scarred man's gaze hardened. He shifted slightly, placing himself between Eleanor and the stranger. "Her place," he said slowly, "is not for you to decide." The little girl tugged at his coat. In a soft, curious voice, she asked, "Papa, is she lost?" Eleanor's heart thudded. The scarred cowboy glanced down at his daughter, then back at Eleanor. His scar looked fearsome, But his eyes were unexpectedly kind. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am, you're safe now." For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, Eleanor felt the faintest spark of hope. The walk to the ranch was long, stretching beyond the town into open country where golden fields waved beneath the sun. Eleanor followed the scarred cowboy and his little girl in silence, her mind spinning. She had left everything behind for a promise that no longer existed. The man she was supposed to marry was dead, and now she was being led by a stranger whose name she didn't even know. The little girl slowed her steps until she was beside Eleanor. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, her braids bouncing as she walked. She looked up with bright, curious eyes. "My name's Ruth," she said softly. "What's yours?" Eleanor blinked, startled by the kindness. "Eleanor." Ruth smiled shyly, then reached out her small hand. Eleanor hesitated, then let Ruth's tiny fingers curl into hers. Something inside her chest loosened, though she didn't yet understand why. At the ranch house, a sturdy cabin with a porch shaded by oak trees, the cowboy finally spoke more than a sentence. "Jackson Cole," he said simply, setting down his hat. "This here's my place. You can stay until you decide what comes next." Eleanor's voice wavered. I don't wish to impose. I'll find work, perhaps." Jackson shook his head. "Town ain't safe. Not for you, not right now." His gaze flicked to Ruth, then softened. "Stay." Ruth clapped her hands, delighted. "She can stay, Papa? Please?" Eleanor's throat tightened. No one had pleaded for her presence in years. She only nodded, afraid her voice would break. That evening, Eleanor sat by the hearth while Ruth played with carved wooden animals. The ranch felt strangely alive with laughter, though she knew it was not truly hers. Her heart wrestled with uncertainty. What if the townsfolk whispered that she was shameless, living under the roof of a man not her husband? Her fears proved true soon enough. The next morning, when she stepped into town to fetch flour, whispers swirled around her like dust in the wind. "Cole's got himself a new woman already. A mail-order bride? Ha! Must be desperate. She won't last a week." Heat burned Eleanor's cheeks. She hurried away, her basket clutched tight. But no matter how she tried to ignore the words, they sank deep into her bones. When she returned to the ranch, Ruth rushed out to greet her. The child held up a bouquet of wild flowers, petals crooked but bright. "These are for you," Ruth said proudly. "You smell better than the flowers, though." Eleanor laughed through sudden tears. She bent to hug the girl, the harshness of town fading in that small, pure moment. But shadows lingered at the edge of her new life. One evening, Ruth fell suddenly ill, her small body burning with fever. Eleanor sat at her bedside, dabbing a cloth on her forehead, fear clawing at her heart. Jackson stormed into town, returning with the doctor. Dr. Bennett, a man with cold eyes and a calculating smile, prepared a bottle of medicine. "Give her this, twice a day," he instructed. "It'll cure her." Eleanor took the bottle, but when she uncorked it, a bitter, acrid scent hit her nose. Something about it was wrong. She remembered the banker's sneer, the doctor's silence when Jackson had confronted him before. Her heart raced. Could it be possible? Could the very men sworn to help be the ones trying to harm? Eleanor pressed the cork back firmly, setting the bottle aside. Jackson frowned. "Why don't you give it to her?" Eleanor met his gaze, her hands trembling. "Because," she whispered, "I don't trust him." Ruth stirred, murmuring in her fevered sleep. She reached out blindly and caught Eleanor's hand. "Mama," the girl whispered. Eleanor froze, tears spilling down her cheeks. She had been in Copper Creek only days, and already this child, innocent, desperate for love, had spoken the one word Eleanor thought she would never hear. "Mama." The night dragged on, with Ruth's fever climbing higher. Eleanor never left her side, whispering soft prayers and brushing damp hair from the child's forehead. Jackson paced the room, his scarred jaw tight with worry. When the first light of dawn broke across the prairie, a pounding rattled the door. Jackson snatched up his rifle, but before he could lift it, the door burst open. 2 deputies stepped inside, flanked by the banker with a smug grin. "Jackson Cole," one deputy barked. "You're under arrest for theft of property and fraud." Eleanor gasped. "What nonsense is this?" The banker tipped his hat, his eyes gleaming. "Funny thing. Turns out deeds from Thomas Cole's ranch have gone missing. And wouldn't you know, they were found in Jackson's barn." Jackson's face darkened. "You planted them," but the deputies shoved him toward the door. Ruth sat up weakly, coughing. "Papa, where are you going?" Jackson tried to steady his voice. "I'll be back soon, sunshine." His eyes locked on Eleanor's. Stay with her. Protect her. And then he was gone, dragged into the morning light as if he were a common criminal. For a long moment the cabin was silent except for Ruth's ragged breathing. Eleanor's hands shook as she pressed a cool cloth to the child's forehead. Fear threatened to crush her. She was alone, with no husband, no family, no protection. But then Ruth's small fingers clutched hers. "Don't let them take Papa," she whispered. "Don't let them take you." A fire lit in Eleanor's chest. She had been timid and terrified for too long. If she wanted this child safe, if she wanted justice for Jackson, she had to act. By midday, Eleanor stood in the heart of Copper Creek's dusty main street, her bonnet shadowing determined eyes. Townsfolk paused their chores to listen as she raised her voice, trembling but resolute. "They've jailed an innocent man. Jackson Cole is no thief. He's a protector, a father, and the only reason I'm alive today." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some scoffed, others frowned, but a few nodded. Encouraged, Eleanor pressed on. "You all know the banker and Dr. Bennett have lined their pockets while your children go hungry. They tried to poison Ruth. Do you think they'll stop there? How many more will suffer before we say enough?" A miner stepped forward, his face grim. "My boy died last winter after taking Bennett's medicine." Another voice rose from the back. "And my husband lost his land to the banker's tricks." The murmurs grew louder. Farmers, wives, and miners gathered, anger sparking in their eyes. Eleanor's voice strengthened. "We cannot let evil men rule this town. If they can take Jackson, they can take any of you. But together, we can stop them." The women nodded first, mothers clutching their children. Then the miners, fists clenched. A spark had become a flame. Back in his cell, Jackson sat on the hard bench, staring at the floor. He had lived too long believing he was meant to carry his burdens alone. But outside a sound reached him, a chorus of voices chanting, rising against injustice. He lifted his head, hope flickering. Eleanor's voice carried above them all, fierce and unyielding. For the first time in years, Jackson realized he was not alone. And for Eleanor, standing tall despite trembling knees, the truth hit her like a bolt of lightning. She was no longer a terrified bride with no home. She was a woman fighting for her family. The morning sun had barely risen when the air in Copper Creek grew heavy with tension. A crowd gathered outside the courthouse, their faces etched with anger and hope. Women clutched their children, miners gripped their tools like weapons, and Eleanor stood at the front, her chin high, though her heart pounded. Inside, Jackson was dragged before the judge. The banker strutted in with false confidence, waving forged papers. Dr. Bennett sat smugly at his side, a vial of his poison medicine hidden in his coat. "This man," the banker announced, "is a thief and a liar. He forged deeds to steal his own cousin's land, and now his so-called bride is spreading slander about us all." Gasps echoed through the room. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice ringing clear. "You lie! Those deeds were planted, and you know it. And as for your doctor, he's no healer. He tried to poison Ruth, Jackson's little girl." The judge banged his gavel, shouting for order. But before silence could fall, a child's weak voice pierced the hall. "It's true," Ruth whispered, clutching Eleanor's hand. "He made me drink it. It hurt. Mama said no more." The word "mama" hung in the air like a bell. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she stood firm. The crowd erupted in fury. Miners shouted, wives screamed, and fists shook in the air. The judge tried to quiet them, but it was too late. Justice was no longer in his control. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked through the window. Glass shattered. Chaos exploded. The banker's hired men stormed the courthouse, revolvers flashing. Eleanor grabbed Ruth and ducked behind a bench as bullets tore into the walls. Jackson lunged forward, breaking free from his captors. With one swift motion, he grabbed a deputy's rifle and fired back. The townsfolk scattered, some screaming, others rallying with sudden courage. The miners charged in, swinging pickaxes while women hurled whatever they could grab. Jackson's scarred face blazed with fury as he fought his way toward Eleanor and Ruth. Another outlaw aimed at them. Eleanor screamed, then Jackson threw himself in front of them. The gun fired, and the bullet slammed into his shoulder. He staggered, but stayed on his feet, teeth clenched. "You'll never touch my family," he growled, firing back with deadly precision. The outlaw fell. The room thundered with chaos until one by one the villains were overpowered. The banker tried to flee, but miners dragged him down. Dr. Bennett shrieked as townsfolk ripped the poisoned vials from his pockets. At last, silence fell. Only the groans of the defeated men filled the hall. Eleanor knelt beside Jackson, her hands shaking as she pressed against his wound. Tears streamed down her face. "You fool," she whispered. "Why would you risk your life like that?" Jackson's eyes softened, the pain in them eclipsed by something deeper. "Because you and Ruth are my life now." Ruth crawled into his lap, clutching him tightly. "Papa, don't go. Please don't leave us." Jackson wrapped his good arm around them both, his scarred face breaking into the faintest smile. "I'm not going anywhere, sunshine. Not anymore." The courthouse smelled of smoke and gunpowder, but the fight was over. The banker lay bound, his fine clothes torn, his watch chain snapped from his vest. Dr. Bennett cowered in the corner, his vials of poison shattered across the floor. The judge, trembling and pale, had lost the last of his authority. The townsfolk, miners, mothers, ranchers, stood shoulder to shoulder, no longer afraid. One miner spat on the floor. "We don't answer to crooks anymore." The crowd cheered, a thunder of voices that rattled the windows. The banker tried to protest, but his words were drowned in anger. Deputies loyal to justice hauled him and Bennett away, their power finally broken. Outside, the morning sun spilled golden light across Copper Creek. It felt like a new dawn. Eleanor sat on the courthouse steps, Ruth curled in her lap, Jackson resting beside them with his arm in a sling. The child's head leaned against Eleanor's chest. Her voice, soft but steady, broke the silence. "Papa fought for us." Eleanor's throat tightened. She brushed Ruth's hair, her heart overflowing. "Yes, darling, he did." Jackson turned his head, studying Eleanor with weary but tender eyes. "And you fought for me, for all of us. I heard your voice out there. You made them listen." Eleanor blushed, shaking her head. "I was terrified." He smiled faintly. "So was I. But fear doesn't mean you stop. It means you fight anyway." The days that followed were unlike any the town had ever seen. Farmers and miners banded together, forming a cooperative to protect one another from men like the banker. The women, inspired by Eleanor's defiance, met weekly to ensure no widow, orphan, or bride was ever left alone again. For the first time, Copper Creek began to feel less like a collection of strangers and more like a community, and at the center of it, the scarred cowboy, the brave bride, and the little girl who had changed them both. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the prairie sky in hues of fire and gold, Eleanor stood on the porch of the ranch house. The scent of bread drifted from the kitchen. Ruth's laughter rang from the yard, and Jackson leaned against the railing, his good arm resting near hers. "Funny," he murmured, gazing across the fields. "I thought scars meant I'd never belong again. Thought no woman would ever want to look my way." Eleanor's hand found his, fingers twining. "And I thought being a mail-order bride meant I'd never be more than someone's last choice. But Ruth," she smiled through tears, "she called me Mama, and for the first time, I felt chosen." Jackson turned, his scar catching the last light of the sunset. Slowly, he bent and kissed her, gentle, certain, as though sealing a vow. Later that night, as the lamps glowed warm inside, Ruth climbed into Eleanor's lap, her small arms wrapping around her neck. "Can you be Mama now?" she whispered, her eyes wide and hopeful. Eleanor pressed her lips to the child's forehead, her tears falling freely. "Yes, sweetheart. I will be Mama. Forever." Jackson watched them, his heart fuller than it had ever been. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, a ring, simple and strong, fashioned by his own hands. "Eleanor Hayes," he said, his voice steady, "I don't have riches to offer, but I have this ranch, this child, and my whole heart. Will you be my wife?" Eleanor looked at him, at Ruth, at the home she never dreamed she'd find, and she whispered the only answer her heart had left. "Yes." The little girl squealed with delight, clapping her hands. "Now I really have a Mama and Papa." And as laughter and love filled the ranch, the prairie night carried a promise that even in the harshest land, hearts could heal, families could be forged, and a terrified bride could become the mother and wife she was always meant to be.